So, in my book, I refer to like Teslas for all. So, like, you could pass a policy that says everyone gets a Tesla, but like, even if you have the money for that, you actually have to make the Teslas. You actually have to have the resources for all that. And you actually have to make sure that work gets done, that there's incentive to do that work. That has to all go into this picture.
Welcome to the Future's Edge podcast. I'm Jim Urio. As always, the brains behind the operation, Bob Iacchino. And today we have a special guest, and it's special because oftentimes we live in an echo chamber, and I like to hear someone who has different opinions than I. We have Scott Santens, the author of the book, Let There Be Money, an unapologetic promoter of UBI. One thing, it is 2023. We are on social media. We have to go by the rules, which is if we disagree on anything, we become mortal enemies and we have to hate each other with the heat of 1,000 suns. Do you agree to those? Do you agree to those rules? No?
Yeah, those are standard rules, aren't they?
Standard rules these days. There's just so much that I'm really interested in your opinion. And again, the UBI thing, I don't have as strong an opinion as I do on the MMT thing, so I'm pliable if you can make a good argument. But my question about UBI, the first thing, should we start with a silliness first, Bobby? Do I have to ask him his favorite movie, if he likes dogs or cats? Yeah,
No, do the silliness.
Lightning round first. Favorite movie? You have 5 seconds to answer and you will be judged.
Empire Strikes Back.
Wow.
Nice. Okay. You walk to a bar. What's the drink you order the most? What's your favorite drink?
Usually like a German Pilsner.
Oh, very nice. Dogs or cats?
Dogs.
Bad boy.
Do you have a dog? And if so, what's its name?
I do. I have a long-haired Chihuahua named Titus.
Titus. Where does that name come from? Is it significant in any way or just it's cool?
We wanted a strong name, and my wife actually came up with it, named after that character from that Netflix show, Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt.
Oh, I love Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. There's a girl who serves me coffee who's from Kentucky, and she's an actress, and she came to Chicago, and she's definitely the Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. She's in Chicago so I call her that every day. I love that show, by the way.
Strong name on a Chihuahua kind of reminds me of you, Jimmy, and I don't know why.
I was about to say the same joke, just so you know, smart guy. A Chihuahua who has a tough name and thinks he's tough. That's me. Okay, let's roll with UBI right off the bat. So UBI, Universal Basic Income, you're an unapologetic proponent of that. And I've read a lot of the stuff you've written, but we have to go over it for our viewers too, which most of them are going to be very fertile ground for your views because they probably disagree. Do you think there's something different about today's world, today's economy that makes UBI more appropriate than, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago?
Oh, absolutely. I actually think that we should have started doing this, 30, 40 years ago. I think part of that reason is back in 1973 is when productivity decoupled from wages. So for the most part, before that, they rose in line. As workers got more productive, they got paid better and better. And then post 1973, productivity has continued going up and up and up, and wages have not at all kept up with that. We've just seen larger inequality as the benefits of total national productivity have flowed to fewer and fewer people. I think part of the difference too between now and previously, decades ago, is this transformation of work where you could graduate high school and go and get a job, a high quality, live the American dream job in a manufacturing plant or something. You could be the only earner in your household and live a nice, solid middle-class life and feel like job security. Nowadays, that doesn't really exist anymore. You need to have multiple people in the house, multiple jobs. Those jobs are not jobs usually that you're working for, 20, 30 years or something. These are jobs that you have for a few years at a time, if you're lucky, or maybe it's more contract work, or maybe it's even like gig work. With those gigs especially, but any kind of contract work, freelance work, you don't have the same safety net as used to apply. You also don't have pensions like you used to have. So just a very different kind of situation now, much less insecure existences.
So here's another question, and Bob, I want you to take the question of that too, because my first pushback would be, we've experienced a situation where tradesmen, there's been a big thirst for tradesmen in this country. We had a guy by the name of Luke Groman on our podcast, and he contends that the next 10 to 20 years, will be characterized by plumbers making the same as partners at Goldman used to make. I think you seem a bit younger than us. How old are your children, by the way?
I don't have any children.
So, but I think we're probably a little older. My children, our generation, seemed like did not want to push their kids to be plumbers, electricians, carpenters. How do you balance those two things with a need for those jobs, which could be good paying jobs, plus the fact that technology has created this big schism as you laid out?
Yeah, no, it's interesting too to see like kind of the way that automation has been affecting the economy for decades has been this kind of like coring out of the middle. And that was basically through a lot of these kind of manufacturing jobs. And so this was offshoring and automation, and we created more jobs. It's true that when you automate jobs, you create more jobs, but the jobs that we've been creating have been towards like the lower end of the spectrum. So this is lower skill requirements and often lower pay, again, like less secure. And we've created some better jobs like that pay more, that require higher skills too. But for the most part, it's been kind of this loss of the middle and this kind of like polarization with more towards the bottom and less towards the top. And now with AI, sure enough, we're in this situation where it's now those really closer to the top that you're going to be seeing a lot more automation wise. And then the jobs towards the bottom or the bottom middle, or even just solid middle that are still those kind of plumbing jobs, those trades jobs, those are indeed like the safer jobs. So here we have the situation too, where, like you said, people had been encouraging people to go to college and get this degree and not go to those jobs. And now they've got all the student debt and they're not finding these jobs and that's going to be automated. So yeah, it's in a situation now where there's going to be an automation of a kind of different demographic than there has been.
So Scott, if I could, rather than this entire hour being pushed back, the whole reason you're on this podcast, you and I had a little bit of a very respectful back and forth on Twitter, which is fucking rare. I want everybody to go back and look at our Twitter because we were like, thanks,
I don't even believe it.
I think, Bob, you're great. Here's what I think. Scott, let me buy you a coffee. Here's what I think. It's wonderful, by the way. But you have a unique perspective on, because everybody always wants to know where this money's going to come from, right? I mean, there's UBI proponents out there that say we just tax the 1%, we tax the hell out of them, as if somehow they're not going to find their way out of that, as they always do. Can you kind of go over your entire vision as much as you can fit in the next 5 minutes or so to how this would actually play out in a very real sense?
Yeah. So first of all, whenever like the common question is, how do we pay for it? That's certainly one of the most common questions, along with won't this cause inflation or won't people stop working? Like those are like the top three. So when it comes to affordability, I also like to first ask, well, get people to consider what is the cost of not having a basic income? Because I think we kind of pretend that not doing anything is free, but like poverty costs a lot of money. Inequality, insecurity, these things have costs that we're paying in kind of like invisible or less visible ways. So, there is a cost to poverty that means that you pay more for your healthcare premiums, that you pay more for the stuff that you buy in stores because, there's the cost of theft that's being passed on to that there's all these costs that we aren't really considering. The cost of child poverty has been estimated at being over $1 trillion a year. And the cost of like total crime is in the over $2 trillion a year. So these are expensive things. And I want people to consider basic income as being this investment that would actually have these downstream savings. So we would pay up front, but then on the back end, we would have less crime. We would have more, better health and therefore less utilization of the healthcare system. Like this could be cheaper in the long run with a high ROI. And with that said, when it comes to cost too, we're already doing a lot of things. So we already have over $1.5 trillion in tax expenditures every year. And again, we don't really think of those as been like, like a welfare kind of system, even though it is it's a subsidy for mostly the middle class and the upper class. And then those in the lower end get like the welfare programs. So not only should we look at welfare programs and the reform of those, we should also look at these tax expenditures too. And if we just kind of utilize those and just, shape them into the form of a foundation, then we don't need to do those anymore. So there's a lot of savings that we could do by already obviating the need for these other things. Now, as far as like taxes go, and this is something I get into my book that I think it's important to kind of better understand even the way like money works. And this is not to say at all that taxes are not important, but it's just to say that it's important to understand that what we're talking about is resources. That do we have like enough food for everybody? Do we have enough like materials for housing? Like, can we actually do these things physically, and not about like asking, where does the money come from? Because it's actually quite different for an economy to say tax everybody a little bit of money versus tax like one person, billions of dollars. Like, just because you can come up with the money from taxing someone billions of dollars doesn't mean you can actually afford to actually make all these things happen. So, in my book, I refer to like Teslas for all. So, like, you could pass a policy that says everyone gets a Tesla, but like, even if you have the money for that, you actually have to make the Teslas. You actually have to have the resources for all that. And you actually have to make sure that work gets done, that there's incentive to do that. And that has to all go into this picture. So when it comes to taxes, I want people to understand that this isn't about coming up with like $1 per $1, but that we need to actually figure out what is the best way to actually remove money from the economy that we're putting into it on the federal spending side. The way that taxes and spending actually works, the way people think, is that you tax money first and then you spend it at the federal level. But how it actually works is that you actually spend at the federal level and then you tax to pull that out of it to manage inflation.
And not
when
to
you think
interrupt
about
you,
it
we
that
actually
way,
saw an example of that in the debt ceiling conversation, right? Where
oh yeah,
the people in favor of raising the debt ceiling were saying, look, this is money already allocated. It's already spent. So we need to raise the debt ceiling to raise the money for the money that we already spent. That's sort of what you're referring to, right?
Right. But you already even just spend the money. Like, every time the government spends money, that's essentially just creating it out of nothing. Like, they are the currency issuer. They're just spending the money. And then taxes are about, all right, well, we spent that money. We've got to pull this money out of the economy so that we manage inflation. And that's also where like the term national debt comes from too, is that this national debt, it's not really the same debt as we consider debt. Like, it's not like the government has taken out a credit card and had credit card debt. What it does is it issues treasury securities. It says basically our deficit was, let's say it's $500 billion, and we don't want to inflate the money supply by $500 billion. So let's encourage people, incentivize them to actually pull that money out, to basically freeze that money, to not spend it, to not cause inflation. So then they say, all right, we're going to incentivize this by saying we're going to sell $500 billion worth of treasury securities. This money will be locked up and you'll earn interest on it. So don't spend the money. Here's interest instead. And that's a way of managing inflation thanks to a deficit. So it's like important, I think, to understand the way the actual tax and spending work, because then we can also think, all right, well, if we're taxing money out of the economy, is income tax, is that the best way to do it? Like, do we actually want to disincentivize income, the earning of income through this tax, or are there better ways? So, we could do like transaction taxes or carbon taxes or land value taxes, like various consumption taxes. Like, there's other various ways of pulling money out of the economy in a way that doesn't have the same kind of work disincentive effects that an income tax does. And it wouldn't be as necessarily as polarizing, and people just hate the income tax and none of us like to do it. So there's other ways.
Just to put like a rough figure on it, if you had your way, if you were emperor right now and you're passing UBI, like $15,000 a year, $1,000 a month, what are we talking about? And then I have a follow-up question.
Yeah. So first of all, I guess optimally, I would like us to have a floor that's above the poverty line. And I think you can either think about it that way or think about it as being like, 20%, 25% of GDP per capita, something around like $1,300 per month. That's what I would like to have. But I'm also happy starting with like lower than that. Like, we could even start with $200 a month or something. And in order to do that, we could just say reform the the standard deduction, and say, look, instead of the standard deduction where nobody is taxed on their first, $12, $13, $14,000 of income, then let's just provide everyone a tax credit of $13,000, $14,000, whatever it is. And people can opt into receiving that credit monthly or take it at the end of the year. So it would be a lot cheaper to do something like that. You could still create that solid floor underneath everybody. And you would be replacing that standard deduction and potentially replacing something like, depending on the size of it, something like SNAP, something like that, where it wouldn't make any sense anymore. It would make less sense to do that, or maybe even TANF or something.
I do not have a tremendous amount of confidence in politicians. I don't know if you've seen any of my stuff on Twitter. And I think that's a a reasonable response from me. And I'm not even necessarily trying to be funny, but here's my concern, and I want you to address it and make me feel better. So let's say we pass the poverty line, $1,300 a month, and that's passed. And there's nothing then for the politicians to dangle in front of their constituents. Aren't you concerned that 5 years later they'll be talking about then national health care, free school, all this thing that will be adding on top of it to create this extremely sort of cumbersome payouts to the lower class?
Yeah, so I would say I don't trust politicians either. I trust people, which is also another reason why I think basic income makes sense. I think it's something to look at as an example of the UBI in practice is the dividend that has existed in Alaska since 1982. So they've had a UBI for 40 years. Now, UBI being, that's universal, it's unconditional, it's to everyone, and it's on a regular basis. So this is a small annual basic income. But if you're getting $3,000 and there's 5 people in the household, that's $15,000 that year. That's a pretty good chunk of change, and it's very helpful. I'm interested in looking at, what is the politics like that? They look at this as being a pre-distribution. So it's a way of saying, like, they actually are looking at government as they don't trust them. They're saying, no, instead of the money going to the government to choose to spend, the money goes to us, and then we get to choose how to spend it, and it avoids going into the politicians' hands. I like the way that thinking is, and I think that also sets that precedent of saying, look, the government has to provide at least this amount to the people to make their own decisions, and then the people are better able to determine what else it is that they want, if anything. A population that already has a basic income, I think they're going to be looking at something and a politician, offering something else and saying, how about this is let's dangle this in front of you. They'll be looking at that as, well, that'll require higher taxes. And is that worth it? Like, do I want to pay higher taxes for that? Or even, why don't you just raise the basic income more because that's working so much better? And in Alaska, they could have grown this at any point along the way, and it's been very stable. And in fact, it's the opposite, where it's a danger. Politicians can end their careers by actually messing with the dividend in Alaska. And so I think that's a good example of people, it actually being activating. It's politically activating. It creates a constituency. People, because they're receiving that dividend and they're saying, that's mine, that's not yours to mess with. And I will vote you out if you mess with this. And we will vote for politicians that respect this and respect us. And we're not going to vote for other people that don't do that. So the politics of it is really interesting in Alaska.
So, Scott, let's take the Alaska example for a minute. One of the problems I have with this is these small sample sets. It's easy to achieve things, which is one of the reasons that I always believe that you should vote locally and not worry so much about voting nationally. Now, I do both, right? But I'm very aware of who my state congressperson is and who the mayor is and things like that, because affecting change in a very small area is generally much more successful than in a broad, diverse, economically diverse, much worse than it used to be economically diverse United States. And this is one of the things that worries me about it. And I wonder how you see it. You look at a place like Alaska, they discover oil, they decide that oil belongs to the people in the state of Alaska, and they produce a dividend off of that oil. And everybody goes, wow, this is great. You could have a politician that comes in and says, I want to legalize killing your mother past a certain age, but I'm not going to mess with your dividends. As a matter of fact, I'm going to increase it. And that's the kind of thing that worries me about this. When I try to think about it, I think, what are the problems with this? Because, let's say you made it $1,300 a month. I'll take it. I'll assume, let me rephrase this. Most UBI that I see, whether it's Andrew Yang or somebody else, has been like, look, everybody gets it. Doesn't matter who you are. Everybody gets it. This way, nobody complains. But people do complain, and they do want more. And generally, because the people who don't necessarily need it, you still get one vote if you don't need it. And the people who would like 1,300 to become 1,500 to become 2,500 is a much larger block of people. How do you propose dealing with something like that? Maybe it comes from the source of the money. I don't know. It's a serious question.
Yeah, again, I think in practice, people just don't seem to vote that way, especially in Alaska. They could have been upping this and in making sure that, well, how do we grow this? Well, let's pay taxes too. Like, they could have voted for a state income tax to grow the fund even more. They could have decided, well, we're putting oil revenue in it, but there's other natural resource revenue. There's other things we could do to actually grow the fund and make sure that we get paid more. There's also been politicians that have been like, vote for me and I'll increase it, to $4,000 a year or whatever. They haven't won that. The people themselves, I think, are pretty smart, and I think that that's valuable to have people with differing opinions, because you have a strong base of people who are like, I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to change something in a big way, and others who are like, well, let's actually try to do something different. And that interplay between usually the left and the right, I think, can create a form of stability around that kind of worry of, no, we're going to go crazy and we're going to ramp it up, and it's all going to go crazy. I think in general, the middle class and the strength of that middle class has been a bulwark of stability for the US, which is again part of this danger of the loss of the middle class. We want to make sure that enough people have enough and exist in a way that they're not stressed out, they're living secure lives, they can make good positive decisions, and in that case they usually do. We start to see craziness when people are freaked out, angry, insecure, full of fear, and that's where I would argue that we're at right now.
And so let me propose something and see what you think of it. And if you think this is idiotic, please use that exact word.
No, exactly. Don't hold back at all.
I've always thought, because of the way that I think locally, so even your example of Alaska, it's a great example, and it shows a lot of faith in people that I likely don't have. But I definitely have faith in smaller groups of people. So I came from Chicago 3.5 years ago now, and I live in one of the meccas of keeping up with the Joneses, which I personally hate, in Southwest Florida. And if a neighbor gets a new car, everybody else is trying to figure out how they can get a new car. I proudly don't participate in that bullshit, but I can imagine part of what keeps these sort of HOA meetings civil is you come to a conclusion. And if you're the one person who's arguing against the consensus, you see them every day. You got to look at them and they're like, yeah, that's that idiot who, wants to put a hot tub in the middle of the pool as opposed to the edge, right? Stupid stuff like that. I don't understand how you get someone in Detroit or in Los Angeles or in New York or in Boston to understand why somebody in Montana needs to get the same as them. Or, this is the whole problem I have with when people talk about a living wage. AOC is fond of talking about a living wage, but a living wage for a single mother in Brooklyn is a completely different thing than a living wage for a 21-year-old guy in Brooklyn who just looks for the cheapest happy hour. You can't pay them the same. What if this kind of thing were done locally based on the contributions to that region of that region, sort of like in Alaska? Does that make sense to you, or am I now?
Oh yeah, no, I would. I believe in both. More states coming on board and following the Alaska model, both before basic income comes out nationally, in order to build support for that nationally, and also to continue existing afterwards. Because again, I believe even after everyone has a national UBI, then Alaska is still going to have their dividend on top of it for their own reasons. In Alaska, it has the ability to kind of scale in more expensive areas. So there is strength in this one amount fully nationally, and that actually disproportionately benefits rural areas. It's usually a lot more expensive to live in urban populated cities. If it's the same everywhere, then you're going to be a lot better off living in a cheaper cost of living rural area. And I think that it's vital to actually regrow Main Street USA as far as all of these businesses that have closed up shop, as a lot of this economic activity moved towards the cities and move towards like your Walmarts and those bigger box businesses away from the small businesses in rural areas. So national basic income, great, especially for rural areas, but states too, yes, they should do that. In fact, Oregon is actually potentially going to be the next one to do a universal dividend. They're calling it the Oregon People's Rebate. They're going to be, hopefully, the signatures are being gathered, and they're looking to vote on that in 2024. So next year, if they do that, then if they vote yes, then everyone in Oregon would start receiving $750 as their dividend. And what they're doing for that is increasing the corporate tax rate on those companies with over like I think $1 million of revenue. So you're looking at like the Nikes and stuff in Oregon. And that's kind of like setting things up too, as far as like, the further concentration of technology in the hands of like, via AI through companies that own that. How do you actually get something that benefits everybody through that? So that would be a mechanism at the state level. And then, I hope that other states do the same thing, and cities can do it too. I would love to see a city do that. So far we're seeing these kind of pilots that are usually pretty small. Maybe there are a couple hundred. In Chicago, there's the Cook County pilot and the Chicago pilot that are, a few thousand people in that. But those are actually those aren't universal. Those are usually targeted towards those in poverty or in some kind of specific situation, like maybe they're pregnant or they're an artist or, these kinds of different things, and not universal. But I would love to see like a city do that.
Yeah, I don't have a question here, Jimmy. And I know you got something you want to go to, but just real quick, Nike's a good example because Nike is using very little from Oregon. So it'll be interesting to see is if they raise taxes on somebody like a Nike, if Nike all of a sudden decides that Texas is a better place to be, like some of the companies in California. I don't think Nike will because Phil Knight is such a barefoot runner type. But,
but it's a real risk.
It's completely different than Alaska, right? Because the Alaska, they're taking the money from the ground in Alaska.
Right. Every company's got to go to Alaska, to drill up that oil.
Based on what you said, the money we're talking about is unconditional. There's no like cap of what you can make on traditional income, because that would, we've seen how that affects some welfare where like all of a sudden if you take a job making 50 grand and you lose your welfare benefit, you're screwed. But my worry is that this starts off in our heads. And Bobby, I disagree with this program, but not as much as you would think I would, Bobby. I think there's a lot of merit to this discussion. Help me allay my fears here. It gets to a point where it's going to be instituted. And then people start bitching like that guy who makes 250 grand gets the same amount as me. This is unfair. And then all of a sudden they start taking what's this beautiful idea of yours and saying, yeah, no, that's right. If you make over 50 grand, you can't get it. And all of a sudden we're back to square one where we're screwed and people have a disincentive to provide their own income. Are you concerned about that as well?
I think the universality is a key component that actually adds its strength. And also, there is actually a misunderstanding too that I think is part of the issue that even helps push against universality, which is that the common question is, well, universal, you mean Bill Gates gets it too? Elon Musk gets it too? And it's like, well, yes, because they are, an American citizen, just like everybody else, and they get that. But also, their taxes are going to go up. However mechanism that we do it, be income tax or land value tax or transaction tax or whatever, if it's any kind of consumption tax, let's say take the Andrew Yang example. So it was a 10% value added tax. 10% value added tax, let's assume that it all goes into what is being purchased. Let's for simplicity's sake. So for someone who is spending $120,000 a year, then 10% of that goes to the value added tax. So they owe $12,000, or that's what they spend as part of the goods that they buy, goods and services that they buy. And as a result of that, it essentially nullifies the $12,000 basic income that they receive. So they get the dividend, but they pay for an additional $12,000 in taxes. That's like the crossover point. So below that, people are net recipients, and above that, people are net payers. And I think that if people understand that, why would you push against, I want more because, Bill Gates is getting $1,000 and I'm getting $1,000. And it's like, well, if you understand that Bill Gates is spending a lot more than his $1,000, he's not coming out ahead, then there's not going to be a reason to push against that, especially if universality means that it's actually happening and it's strong, versus programs for the poor being targeted are very weak.
So, Scott, have you heard of Milton Friedman's negative income tax plan?
Oh, yeah. Negative income tax. Yeah.
Milton Friedman had this idea that basically everyone needed to file a tax return, regardless of income. And we would come up with some base level. And for the example, I'm just going to use $30,000, right? Everybody gets $30,000 a year, right? And as you earn over and above the $30,000, half of that in base level comes off. So in other words, let's say that I earn $25,000, right? And everyone gets a base level of $30,000. So I get $5,000 at the end of the year. And he said, you can estimate it and pay it out monthly and then square up at the end of the year, just like most of us do with our taxes now. The converse of that would be $30,000 is the base. Somebody goes out and gets a part-time job where they earn $10,000. They now lose $5,000 of that $30,000 base, and they end up with $35,000. So there's actually an incentive to work built in there, right?
Yeah, you can look at it as an incentive or look at it as a slight disincentive too. There's two ways to look at that coin. But anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, I mean, I guess if you wanted to live on 30, yeah, but you're always gaining by working in this particular scenario,
yes.
Right? Whereas other plans like welfare, for example, if you get above a certain area, they take your SNAP card. They just take it all away. If you make $1, they take $1 away. If you make $300, they take $300.
And that's bullshit, right?
It is
stupid.
So it's just somebody might say, hey, I got offer, I can get a part-time job at McDonald's, but I lose my SNAP. Why would I do that?
Yeah.
Whereas in this particular case, if you could make an extra $30,000, you're now at a net $45,000. Why wouldn't you do it? And that sounds a little bit where you're going with that VAT. Am I correct on that or no?
Well, yeah. So actually, a VAT combined with the UBI could be considered a negative consumption tax. And just to get into a little bit of negative income tax, I think that's great too to cover. A lot of people don't know that Milton Friedman was actually asked about universal basic income in comparison to a negative income tax too. And he said there were two ways of doing the same thing. They are like you could design these things to be identical in net outcome and net cost. The UBI says, here's $1,000. And depending on your, amount of income that you earn, maybe you phase this out at you apply a tax to your earnings at say a 30% flat tax rate, let's say, and then a negative income tax would be designed to be the exact same way, but then phase out at a 30% rate. And so if you look at both of those things, they're accomplishing the same thing. They have the same marginal tax rates and they have the same incentive issues, and they cost the same. It's just, do you want to provide people, or do you want to actually determine in advance what someone should be getting based on like an estimate of what their income might be? Or do you want to actually just provide them the floor and then determine via their income taxes what their net should be and what you should tax them because of that? I think at this point, and I would be happy with either one, like I support either one. I think that there's better reasons for the UBI, especially now. And actually the most recent thing I wrote was really getting into the details between negative income tax and UBI actually. And the reason I think the UBI, like a main reason that's better, is that a negative income tax essentially applies an income tax of, let's say if it's a 50% phase out rate, essentially applies a 50% tax to the recipients in that phase out range. I consider that a high marginal tax rate. Like I consider that non-ideal. I don't think people should be losing half of everything that they earn. That's a disincentive. I would prefer something to be more like 10 to 20%, especially at the bottom end, to make sure that people still have an incentive to raise their incomes more. With a
Real
UBI,
quick, in fairness to my little bald idol, he used 50% for the purposes of math in his example.
Yeah. His was very,
you could make it 10%, you could make it 20. Go ahead.
But it is like talked about pretty regularly, not only for simplicity, but just like even our SSI program has a 50% phase out rate. SSI was actually what the negative income tax ended up becoming, basically. For those people who don't know, SSI, Supplemental Security Income, that's our primary disability program. So if you can't earn money, then you are provided, it's around $800 per month if you're able to qualify for it. And then any money you earn is taxed. You lose your benefit at a 50% rate. So that's what that is. To get back to the negative income tax and UBI, it makes so much more sense to say, instead of applying a 50% tax rate to those at the phase out range, let's just spread that across the entire income spectrum. And when you do that, you can actually lower the rate. So instead of a 50% rate that certain people in the phase out range pay, you could lower that to say, 10 or 20% across the entire spectrum. And then you have people, Bill Gates would be paying part of that instead of the person in the phase out range.
Do you see a need for a flat tax to go along with this? Just a flat income tax?
I think that's certainly a simple way to go about it.
There's part of the reason I say that, Jimmy, is because, with the size of the tax code, right? You mentioned already that, universal basic income, SSI, that's what it became basically. And I have zero faith that a humanitarian altruistic UBI that you're talking about doesn't somehow become something like an SSI at the end of the day, because everything seems to be negotiations. And I've always been a fan of a graduated flat tax where people under certain income pay zero, then the next level pays 15%. I'm pulling these numbers out of my ass. And then the rich pay 30, and that's it. And we live on that. And that's it. The government lives on that. Whatever that decided to be. And if it goes up, it goes up for everybody. If it goes down, it never fucking goes down. But it seems to me like in order to get a simplified UBI out there that everybody understands, you all get this, and it's going to be adjusted at the end of the year with your tax base, you have to simplify everything else. And these are just such heavy lifts.
So one thing that it makes me think of too is I do think it's interesting that are you familiar with the fair tax plan being pushed recently? Been being pushed for quite a long time, but a lot of people don't know that it had a UBI as part of it. It was called the family consumption allowance. But the reason that that was part of the plan and that it wasn't really talked about as a basic income, but it was, is because if you're doing a consumption tax and you're taxing people into poverty and by reducing their buying power by making stuff more expensive with the tax, and so in order to neutralize that, you have to make sure that everyone has a prebate, so money in advance of being taxed to cover the amount of the tax. And I think that's also a helpful way of looking at this too. And it's also why I like a transaction tax in a situation, which is, let's just have like a small flat percentage tax on just each transaction so that then you're not even having to worry about, doing complicated taxes. Like, so let's simplify as much as possible. It's so much less of a thing to just pay like a small percentage on each transaction instead of getting this huge bill at the end of the year. And you're like, oh my gosh, like suddenly the government's charging me, like $20,000 or something. Like, that's crazy. But if through the year you're just spending an extra dollar on a beer or whatever, a couple dollars here, a couple dollars there, then by the end of the year, you don't have to pay that huge tax anymore. And then people wouldn't hate it so much.
I have a question for you, Scott. So, okay, on my history, and I'm not trying to say how tough my childhood was because it wasn't tough at all, but I grew up 11 people in one home. My family just owned a third of the home. My belief in the 70s and the 80s was that if I wasn't successful, I wouldn't eat. I mean, after I left the home. My question is just from a theoretical basis, do you believe a dynamic economy has to have a component of if you don't succeed, there has to be well, not massive hardship that accompanies that? Just, and I know the answer to that is yes, but you don't think starvation is obviously the right thing, correct?
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a pretty simple question.
And it's important people understand that the problem really isn't giving people money in for like welfare. The problem is actually taking it away from them as they work, especially at a large rate. Like if you're taxing someone 100%, there's no incentive to earn anything more. And so that's a completely sane decision. It's not that they're lazy. It's that you're taxing them into not earning more income. What's so interesting to me about like a lot of the experiments that I've seen, so much of this is not only like not a decrease in work, but it's actually, you see increases. The Stockton pilot showed that recipients of the basic income were employed, full-time employed. They found full-time employment at twice the rate of the non-recipients. And you saw something similar to that in the Hudson pilot too, after the first year, which was double the rate of employment. And you hear some of these stories, and the stories are like, well, otherwise I couldn't have been able to afford to like take the day off to go do an interview to get a better job. But because I had that cushion and I could afford to take that day off, then I can go do the interview and get that better job. So there's a lot of times people are in not as good jobs just because they can't afford really to get that and they can't take that risk. And that's also related to entrepreneurship, which is another thing I've seen in experiment after experiment, where just huge increases in entrepreneurship, where, in the Namibia UBI pilot, it quadrupled. In the India UBI pilot, the villages that receive basic income were 3 times the rate of the villages that didn't get basic income as far as entrepreneurship goes. I think there's something there as far as, people, first of all, they need capital in order to start a business. So UBI can function as capital. They need to feel that if they fail, that they're not going to, drag their entire families down into poverty. And so UBI means that it reduces risk aversion. And third thing is that you actually create customers. Like there's so many businesses that have started, great businesses doing great things, but they went out of business. Well, a lot of that could have been because people couldn't afford to go there. So if you make sure that people have money to spend, then those businesses can succeed to a degree that they haven't been able to right now, as like, stagnant wages pull money away. So that's, I think, something important too, is that just from what I've seen, you don't need to say people, get nothing if they don't get a job. You just, make sure that they have enough to, have some boots so they can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Don't tell a bootless man to do that. And just make sure that they've got something first. You need money to make money.
You answered what I was about to ask, because I was saying you want a cushion, you don't want a feather bed. There shouldn't be any sort of luxury that is provided by the UBI. It's just you're not screwed if you don't have a job in that.
Yeah,
okay.
With the caveat that over time, I think it should grow. As automation improves, I think it should grow bigger.
Tiny issue I have too, which I don't even think you can solve for me too, is that once the government starts to be the provider, I do worry about them being the puppeteer and having strings attached to it, particularly with around the dawn of central bank digital currencies and huge movements towards the climate shit, which they're going to say if you drive too far, we might punish you. Do you worry about the government having too much control over the individual?
I mean, there is that concern, but also, again, I look at, where can we look for evidence of this kind of in practice? And so Alaska, I think, is a good example, but also I think Social Security is a good example. And so, people are not afraid of starting to receive their Social Security checks because they feel that if they do something the government doesn't like, that they'll lose their checks. You don't see that because people feel it is their rightful earned, that they earned that money, that it's theirs. There's a universality of the program. Everyone expects to, for the most part, start receiving their payments. Some people are worried that they're going to get 75% of their payment, but nobody's worried they're going to get zero. We're going to get something. And we all expect that. So as long as everyone expects to get that, there's a protection of the program. Democrats fear-mongering the Republicans and saying the Republicans want to take this away. And you had that funny event happen, at the State of the Union when Biden, asked about that. And, the Republicans essentially cheered about like not getting rid of Social Security. And it's like, well, I'll hold you to that. There's same thing. Social Security is a third rail. If you really try to get rid of Social Security, you're going to piss off a whole lot of people. And if you try to put strings on those, right, they are the voters. They get what they want. They have Medicare, Medicare Part D, and you don't piss them off. You are not going to say, oh, well, we're doing this CBDC thing. Now we're going to start paying Social Security in that. And you're not going to be able to use it for this, this, and this, and more. Like, no. that's not going to cut it politically.
And it's interesting because when you look at it from that perspective, I guess the studies you mentioned, for example, my opinion, relatively small communities, certainly versus the United States, and relatively short periods of time. And that is honestly my biggest fear. When you have homogenous communities, which smaller communities tend to be culturally, if not ethnically, right? They tend to be very homogenous and they tend to value the same things. For example, you go back to German immigrants coming to this country and they still made pianos when they came here because they were very good piano makers in Germany. It's just a cultural thing. And I always worry about these studies, and it certainly points to experimenting with it on a larger scale. I mean, I would never say that that's not the case. I'm such a cynic about who would administer this, and that's what we kept going back and forth.
Let's have California do it. They're a bunch of idiots. Let's have them do it. If it fails, it fails.
It always sends me back to that quote that is credited to de Tocqueville, right? Where he says the American republic will endure until Congress realizes it can bribe the public with their own money, which seems to be somewhat what we're involved in now in a lot of areas, right? And I guess... And then the second thing about it, from a sort of a pull yourself up kind of, I never like when anybody thinks anything is owed. I mean, I'm the child of immigrants, right? And I remember being 12 years old, and my father started a business because he got fired from his, right? Got fired from his job. He was out there looking to start a business, and his boss found out and said, you want to start a business? You're fired. Go start a business. So he started a business because his pockets were empty, right? And he started it with just work. And I started working when I was 14. And to this day, to my own detriment socially, all I do is work. Someone will say to me, hey, do you mind giving me this piece of content for the weekend? I'm like, yeah, and I'm an immigrant kid. I work. That's what I do. And if I could tell a quick story, I was having lunch, Joe's Stone Crab and Prime Steaks in Chicago, Jimmy. And I was having lunch with a really close friend of mine and his nephew. Right. And him and I are in our 50s and the nephew was in his 20s. And he turned to me after a couple of drinks and he goes, your generation lied to me. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he said, well, you guys said that if I went to college, I'd be able to get a job and I'd be able to work there forever. I'm like, first of all, I never fucking said that to you personally. Number one, that's not what happened to me, by the way. Okay. I worked while I was in college. Number one. I said, but what's your problem with he goes, I can't even get a job as a busboy. I said, I know the chef here. I can get you a job as a busboy right now if you want one. He's like, whoa, what? Then I got to work a lot and I can't go to music festivals if I want. Now, I know this is just a small anecdote, but I don't like those kids. I don't like them.
Fair enough. When Bobby said, can I tell a short story? I was about to just answer, no. I know you for many years. You can't.
He's about to go get a beer, go wash his car. They're not that short. So, but you're very convincing, Scott. You really are.
Can we move on to MMT then? Here's my issue with MMT and modern monetary theory for those watching too. And it's based on four premises, and you have to tell me where I'm wrong. is that one, the issuer of the currency can continually print money as long as they have the resources to back it up. The United States has the printing press, whatever. The problem is that they have to watch carefully for inflation, and then when they see inflation, they raise taxes quickly to zap liquidity out of the system to handle the inflation. My problem with it, because it is that it's theoretically perfect, and I know Stephanie Kelton a little bit. I recommend her book, The Deficit Myth, to many people. I don't agree with any of it, but I recommend it as just to read it and see what other people think. My contention is this, is that notion that we can just spot inflation is a fairy tale. We haven't been able to do that until it's clearly too late. And the notion of being able to quickly raise taxes, particularly where you are depending on election cycle, and the only people who could do that and not have to worry about getting voted out if they raise taxes 2 weeks before the election were people who are politicians and definitely didn't have to worry about re-election. Are those two valid concerns and two valid criticisms of MMT?
Well, sure. But I also think that if you were to ask like Stephanie Kelton about those same questions, she would say that the MMT people don't say that you should wait until inflation happens. It's about thinking, what do you need to do in order to avoid inflation? There should be mechanisms too that you should be able to handle inflation afterwards instead of only relying on the Fed. But there is that kind of thinking in advance, like the mistaken belief of MMT, I think the popular kind of belief out there is thinking that you can just print as much money as you want without consequence. Whereas the real thing is, well, the money isn't the limit. It's that when you do that, you're going to lose value in the currency as you inflate the money supply more and more and more. So that you do need to have methods to pull money out. And that you should, a good rule of thumb is to kind of a one-to-one kind of thinking, but also that you don't have to do only deficit neutral stuff. And that you should actually be thinking in advance, what do we actually need? So when it comes to something like Medicare for All isn't only about coming up with like the taxation revenue. So someone like Bernie Sanders would say, well, let's do like a billionaire wealth tax, and then if you have that wealth tax, you're going to be able to pay for Medicare for All. And so that's the kind of thinking that I want us to get away from, because that's wrong. The way to actually, fund a Medicare for All is to say, well, how do we make sure that medical resources are we can get that to everybody in a low cost way? So that means, does it make sense to limit the amount of doctors like we do now? Does it make sense to limit where doctors can practice? Like, should it be easier for a doctor to do, using the internet to help someone in another state? How do we actually expand the supply of like healthcare? So that we can actually do that for real, instead of this kind of, let's come up with money and then do the program. If you're thinking in advance of how to actually resource something, how to actually meet the demand with supply, that's how you avoid inflation. And I think that's the most important part, is really focusing on how do you maximize economic capacity, especially for these various programs that you want to do.
Does the fact that, let's look at the last 15 years, where every Fed governor came out and told us how badly they wanted inflation. Then let's rewind the clock to a year and a half from now, where reasonable people, we are more than on record saying this is stupid. CPI is already printing over 5%. You've choked the supply chain. But the government and the Fed, they refused to acknowledge there was anything other than transitory. My question is has the events of the last year and a half scared you about, are these people responsible enough to handle the power of MMT?
No, so even in my book, I
gotcha. That's a yes.
Even in my book, I do mention that part of the problem is idiot politicians who don't even understand the tools that they're using. If they think that MMT is like this money printing press and they can do anything, then they'll do stuff stupidly. I think that part of doing it successfully is not only again, better realizing how this stuff actually works, how to actually resource things. But I think we actually need, democracy reform. We need to make sure that we kind of, keep the idiots out, that we have more moderate people in Congress, that, these mechanisms in place, like, things like ranked choice voting, nonpartisan primaries, like these kind of solutions that can actually improve the way our government works are really important for that reason, because you want people who actually have a better understanding of things and who actually are more responsive to people than the existing setup where you just do stupid things. So I agree that's a danger.
Yeah, I don't see what's wrong with being a busboy. I'm still on that stupid kid. My
You're in a
dad.
lot of pain, aren't you?
No, I
Why
mean
don't you have a glass of
my dad
vodka
came
or
from
whiskey or
Italy, and
something to kill the pain?
he was a busboy at the Italian Village on Adams there in Chicago, which I was still there pre-COVID. I don't know if it's
Yeah,
still
I have busboys at my restaurant who started out as busboys making $12 an hour and now make $80 an hour waiting tables on a Friday night. So
I'll
there's
tell you
some
another quick story,
opportunities
Jim. You'll
in
appreciate this.
restaurant.
When my father passed away a little under 4 years ago, there was this kid. He was an immigrant kid. He was a troublemaking kid. And one of the guys that worked for my parents and my brother, they were all in the family restaurant business when I went and did a stupid thing like go work at the CME. This kid came there, and his uncle basically said, just give him a job. He goes, I'll make sure he shows up. Sure enough, about 10 years later, my father passes away, and this kid comes to the wake, and he stands by my father's casket, and his name's Omar. And I'm like, Omar, you've been here a long time. It's okay. Thank you. And I turn, and he's just bawling. He's like, your father saved me. He goes, he beat me up. He made me work. He made me work long hours. He goes, now I have a family. I have a house. I have, I'm so pro immigration. I can't even stand it, but, pro like opening up to
we need
legal
more
immigrants
Omars
who actually want to come here, and where there's a part of automation, Jim and Scott, that I think we sort of price ourselves into. And what I mean by that is, at a certain cost, my brother still owns the restaurant, bakery, deli. It's in Streamwood, Jim, not too far from your place, where, they started this business in 19, whatever it was. And, as things like minimum wage and all these things start to rise, my brother says he can't survive much longer with what he has to pay people to put lunch meat in a piece of bread and put cookies on a cookie tray and he goes, I can't. He goes, I raise my prices in order to keep up. And even though all my stuff is better than the cafe at Walmart, at some point they just go to the cafe at Walmart, right? And this brings me to kind of what I'm trying to say about the whole MMT thing, or I'm sorry, UBI thing, is that at the end of the day, our government is staffed with people. Sometimes people look at the government as this monolith that wants to do good or wants to do bad. And there's people that want to do good, but the government as a whole is just made up of people. And those people can mess up the simplest, most humanitarian, most altruistic policies that we can come up with because it gets them a vote, and it drives me insane. And I've had people say to me, oh, you're just a cynic. You never come up with solutions. It's because I can't fucking think of one, quite frankly, to the mess we're in.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that this is actually, again, one of the reasons why I like UBI and think it's important too, is that it's very simple. You're just saying, look, we got to make a floor. And, whatever that floor is at, we can argue over how to do that. But then, everybody gets the same thing. It is the floor. And right now we employ so many bureaucrats to do all this administration, and they're getting to, they're living in their own fiefdoms. And there's so much there's a whole poverty industry out there. That's even nonprofits are part of the poverty industry. There's so many people employed through the existence and perpetuation of poverty. I think that we need to get around that and say, no, pre-distribution, make sure that people have that money first as a floor, so that these people who want to do with all this other bureaucracy and administration and everything stuff, it's so much harder for them to do that. We don't need any of that. Also, I just want to mention too, as far as like the minimum wage stuff, because I think this is, a really interesting, aspect of UBI too, that's very different. With UBI, you gain this power to refuse, insufficient low wages that you feel is, too low for the work that you're doing. So you don't have to have a minimum wage. If someone can refuse to do that job, they'll do it if they pay enough. So, if you're going to pay $20, $25 or something, and there's no minimum wage, but someone has a UBI to make their own decision, then they can decide no, and you have to pay that. And on the flip side of that, you have the freedom to say yes to actually jobs that would otherwise you wouldn't be able to afford to do. So let's say there is a job that you feel is really important in your local community, but it only pays, $20,000 a year. That's all they can pay. They can't pay more than that. So instead you go off and do like some damaging to society or the environment job for $50,000 because it pays more. But if you have a basic income, then a $20,000 job that's really important to you is suddenly possible in a way that wasn't possible otherwise. And it's something that a minimum wage prices people out of. And so I think that flexibility that UBI provides is also a really good point.
You're going to give that busboy kid a life he doesn't deserve, Scott. I'm telling you.
No,
if people want their stuff blessed.
think as I hear this conversation, I think theoretically our disagreement, my disagreement and yours, is the people to institute the policies. The policies that you state, I think theoretically make quite a bit of sense. I was kind of hoping we'd argue more. Is there any way I can get you to say, "Fuck you, Jimmy, you're a rude piece of shit," and we'll just put that as our clip? Come on, try it. God damn it, Scott. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. You're an idiot. Come on. No.
You make some good points there, Jim.
That's as mean as it can get. I just can't even do it.
Right, exactly. I can't even be mean. Thank you so much for Jonathan. The name of the book is, I don't have the book, Let There Be Money. I'll push your book and I'll read your book and we'll talk about it more. And,
all right, thanks, Jim.
I totally appreciate it. Thank you so much.